The burnt bracken was near to closing, and all the patrons had left the tavern for the night, barring old Jeb, who sat by the dwindling fire, clutching his last ale as if it were keeping him alive. As Hemming cleaned the last of the day's wooden cups, he regarded the frail old man and wondered if, in a way, the drink was doing just that. "Time's up, Jeb," he called across the room, and his last customer said something unintelligible but plainly indignant. "Don't make me handle you again, or you won't set foot back in here for a week." It would be no effort for Hemming, made stocky with his years of pulling pints and hauling barrels up and down the cellar stairs, to bodily remove most of his clientele, let alone the beanstalk of a man by the fire. Jeb knew it too, somewhere inside his addled brain. How he would react depended on just how addled it was. After a moment, he rose and, mercifully, spun on his heel and made his way to the door, mumbling to himself. Hemming followed in case he ended up on the floor, but the old fellow made it outside without incident. The barkeep watched as his customer staggered away for a short while, still expecting him to tumble into the dirt, but soon he was too far down the road towards his house for Hemming to make out even a hint of his gangly shape in the dark. As he turned to go back inside, he saw another figure shuffling slowly toward the inn from the road out of the woods. Man or woman he couldn't tell, but they were short, smaller than his daughter May, who would be 13 on her next birthday. The figure drew closer, and in the light of the window he saw they wore a hood that shadowed the eyes, but the harshly lined lips and the grey curls framing their sunken cheeks told him the visitor was old. He guessed that he was looking at a woman. She bore a thick stick on which she rested herself for a moment when she realized she was being watched. The fingers that clutched the stick were knobbled where arthritis had deformed the joints throughout her years, and her feet were bare, crusted in filth and blood. She had, evidently, been walking for some time. Hemming was dog-tired and longing for sleep, but his good nature wouldn't let him see the old soul go any further without a drink and a meal. She looked as close to death's door as anyone he'd seen, but maybe a small kindness tonight would keep the pale horseman away from her a little longer. "Would you come inside, old mother?" he said, and gestured towards the inn door. "The fire's almost out, but it's still warm, and I can heat you some cider. Should be some cheese left over too." The crone did not look up, but put her armpit on the crotch to take the weight, and used her free hands to produce a flat shard of black slate and a piece of chalk. She started scribbling at it, faster than her gnarled hands would have had him believe possible, and her mouth moved silently as she did. He realized that she was mute. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the tapping and scratching suddenly stopped, and she held up the chalkboard for him to see. In an unpolished but perfectly readable script, it said, "I have a story to tell." He smiled, intrigued. "Well, let's get you inside then, old dear, and you can tell it after you've filled your belly. Seems like a fair trade to me." He held the door open, and she shuffled through into the light and warmth as he followed. The woman was definitely starved, he surmised as he watched her chomp and sup voraciously. She chewed the food well and thoroughly, but with much haste, and craned her head back to swallow each mouthful gradually in several gulps. Each bout of swallowing was accompanied by a clucking sound. It reminded him of a baby bird, fed mushed-up worms and berries by an adult. After finishing the last fifth of a cheese round, 2 ciders, and 2 hard-boiled eggs from the larder, the old woman wiped her mouth on her sleeve and picked up the chalkboard again. Hemming fancied he saw her eyes twinkle under the dark brim of her hood as the chalk scratched hurriedly. "Story now." He nodded at her enthusiastically, but didn't really know whether she was asking or telling him. She offered a single nod in return and started scribbling down words with that same unexpected swiftness, and as Hemming read, he imagined how her voice would sound croaking out the tale. 10 years as women I tended them. 2 boys. My punishment for losing a prince's newborn." "The prince's son who died?" he asked her. "What had you to do with it?" She shushed him with a hiss and went on. "I was midwife to his son, but he died. Not my fault. Born sickly. Blame me." She wiped the slate clean, white dust across her sleeve. Hemming thought to ask something else, but decided against it. Swift as she was, this looked like it would take a while, and he had to sleep sometime. King used me to grow up 2 boys, took from some poor family. Wanted them to grow in quiet with no talking and no words. Wanted to know if they would speak anyway, if they would learn to talk from God. The first stirrings of regret were starting to take root in Hemming's mind. The old woman was mad. Kings didn't kidnap poor children. The prince's son had died as an infant, but everyone knew that. There had been a day of mourning for the whole kingdom. He hadn't even been allowed to open the inn. The woman before him wouldn't have been allowed within 2 feet of a newborn prince. She wiped and scolded again, and made a coughing noise that might have been a laugh. Don't believe me, I see. Now you see. She leaned her head back and opened her mouth, toothless and dark. Tongueless, he saw, and recoiled. That's why she ate like a bird, he realized. She made the coughing noise again and carried on scribbling. My tongue all my life. That was a deal. I made it, and I grew the boys up like he asked. No talking. Never. Hemming was growing ever tired, but found himself oddly fascinated with her ravings in spite of the hour. He'd never heard such fancy in a lifetime of listening to the stories of travellers and the tall tales of drunks as they stopped by the bracken. Her commitment, the effort she was making to write it all down by hand, beguiled him. Her head cocked suddenly to one side, as if she'd noticed something unheard, before the scratches began anew. King delivered food every day, 1 mile from the house so the boys didn't see. Boys grew up strong. I showed them to wash and cook and mend, showed them to fear, so they stayed close and didn't meet people to learn words. How did you teach them fear without words? He asked her incredulously. Surely you had to tell them what to be afraid of. Without warning, the woman gave a loud, piercing shriek, then shrieked again, and the noise startled Hemming into knocking the remnants of his cider over the table. The noise was animal, inhuman and terrifying. All things fear. Don't need words to scare boys. Satisfied that her point had been made, she continued. Odd things then. Bad things. Dead mice on a pantry floor like a dance. Little paws together. Birds land to the sill like someone called. So many birds. Plants changed to red and went more alive. The leaves breathe. One day my door was gone. Had to stay in room, but it came back, and I went down. Found cat was red and wet outside. Fur inside. I heard boys hushing to each other, saying things quiet as a cobweb. One day, boys stop fearing and go out. My door is open, so I follow, shouting, but boys not listening to silly old me. Trees along the way are looking at me with new eyes, big mouths. Grass tying in knots when I walk over it, and wriggling like worms. Now it's me scared. I found boys laughing like angels, but hurting my ears. Wagon horses screaming, stuck together. Too many legs. Boys float me home and love me and talk to me, change me, so I'm crying at all the beauty I see now. Birds on sill are all gone. Hemming's voice was small. Gone where? Gone nowhere. Just not birds. Burn little screechers, not flying. Heads too fat to lift. Living, but shiny like beetles. Hemming rose suddenly from his chair and interrupted as sweetly as he dared. Time to move on, old dear, he said, grinning massively to mask his unease. The boys couldn't learn to speak without a teacher. Language is learned. Now, you're welcome to stop out in the barn, and I'll fix you some more food on the morn. Something was happening that Hemming did not understand. He began to sweat, then sat back down, compelled to listen to her. She clucked and coughed in amusement, then scribbled more words. God was their teacher. That's just blasphemy, said Hemming as the sweat continued to bead and roll down his nose and to blot his shirt in an increasing darkened patch. He became aware of a distant noise but couldn't place it. He pointed at the effigy above the fireplace. What sort of god would do all those things? Create abominations of birds and trees and horses? The old woman's head cocked to one side again, and she smiled without laughing. Not yours. The spell was broken, and Hemming stood up again, drowning in his unease. He had to get her out of here, or else leave himself and never come back. The old woman seemed to hear him. God is coming. She speaks through her 2 boys, and her 2 boys are walking here, talking to all. People get changed from listening, and have to follow. New servants, new slaves, screaming love and pain from new mouth holes. The old woman rose from her seat, and for a second, Hemming thought he saw something black and knuckled, like a spider's leg, poke out from the darkness under her hood, to feel around her face, before darting back inside. Go on then, get out, you mad old witch, he shouted at her, his voice breaking in near panic despite his best efforts to sound stoic. You've a head full of nonsense. What need would some forgotten god have for a beggar like you? Begone! She paused before her hands scrawled out her final message on the chalkboard, which she flipped round so he could see. All gods need a herald. With that, she hid away her writing tools under the many folds of her robes, and took up her stick before walking to the door and making her way outside. Hemming quickly followed and went to shut it behind her, but stopped. The noise he'd noticed in the background was louder now. It was people. He looked down the road to the forest and saw blinking lights through the trees, and he heard them coming as they screamed, dreadfully, in unison.